The stench came first. Before the sound of boots on marble floors, before the clink of armor or the rustle of velvet robes, there was that foul, sour odor, heavy, moist, rotting, creeping through the palace halls like an omen. It was a scent no one dared name aloud, though every courtier recognized it. It was the scent of a dying empire. Years before, no one would have believed that this man, this monarch, this titan, would one day need to be winched into bed with ropes, his body too massive and broken to move. No one imagined that beneath the ornate ceiling of Whitehall, kings could rot while still alive. But this was no ordinary king. This was Henry Tudor. This was England's most feared sovereign, once a golden prince born of prophecy, now a carcass in a crown. He had come into the world under the sign of power, born on June 28, 1491, in the Palace of Placentia. The second son of Henry VII, he wasn't even meant to rule, but fate is cruel and often favors the ambitious. When his older brother Arthur died young, the path to the throne cracked open, and Henry walked through it with the confidence of a man who believed God had personally anointed his blood. At 17, he was crowned King of England. And what a king he was. Tall, athletic, dazzling. With hair like burnished copper and eyes sharp with charm and cunning, foreign ambassadors wrote home about his radiant presence, his chiseled jaw, his courtly grace. The Venetian envoy once described him as the most handsome prince in Christendom, comparing his form to that of a Roman god and his intellect to the brightest minds of Europe. His laughter filled the palace halls, his jousts were legendary, his thirst for power cloaked in a golden veil of majesty. But the man who once embodied Renaissance perfection would within decades descend into a grotesque parody of himself. And it all began with the fall. It was January 1536. Henry, then 44, still fancied himself the warrior king. At a jousting tournament in Greenwich, he charged into the lists, a beast of muscle and pride, atop his powerful steed. But fate doesn't care for pride. The horse buckled. The king crashed. His body slammed against the earth with such force that the crowd screamed in horror. Henry lay motionless, unconscious for 2 hours, and when he awoke, everything had changed. The leg, his right leg, had been badly injured. At first, physicians believed he would recover, but the wound never healed. Over time, it festered into an open ulcer, oozing and splitting, a gaping chasm of rot on the flesh of a king. The stench was unbearable, so vile that it would precede his presence by entire rooms, yet none dared react. To gag or recoil was to risk the wrath of a monarch whose paranoia grew with each heartbeat. That injury, some say, changed more than his body. It changed his mind. Before the fall, Henry was brutal but controlled. Afterward, a storm seemed to possess him. Suspicion curdled into obsession. Rage, once strategic, turned feral. It was in that very year, 1536, that he ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn, his second queen, the woman for whom he had broken from the Pope, the woman he once claimed to love more than life. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, Anne went to the scaffold with her spine straight and her eyes clear, but the world whispered it was all a lie. Henry had created a monster in himself and fed it with her blood. As the years wore on, so did the king. His body ballooned to monstrous proportions. In his youth, his waist had measured a trim 35 inches. Now, it surpassed 52. His weight surged past 400 pounds. Movement became a spectacle of grunts, sweats, and assistants. Doorways were widened for him, special chairs crafted. A hoist system was installed to lift him between chambers. The once virile prince had become a prisoner of his own flesh. His diet betrayed him, or perhaps he betrayed his body first. Feasting like a Roman emperor, he consumed endless roasted meats, game pies soaked in lard, goblets of wine, barrels of ale. Records show he ate up to 5,000 calories daily, rich in fat, poor in sustenance. Vegetables were an afterthought, moderation a forgotten virtue. Meanwhile, the ulcer grew worse. Physicians of the time did what they could, but their methods were crude and cruel. Hot iron cauterization, bloodletting, poultices laced with arsenic and mercury. The treatments drained him body and soul. The wound opened deeper, bone peeked through decaying muscle. Courtiers whispered that the king's leg was eating itself alive. Even still, no one dared speak of his decline. Fear held the court hostage. Henry ruled through terror, and his condition only magnified his tyranny. Every cough behind closed doors, every failed treatment, every tremor of pain had to be swallowed in silence. The king was not dying. No. To suggest such a thing was treason. Yet the truth hung heavy in every corridor. England's lion was rotting from the inside out. By the time Henry reached his 50th year, the air around him had grown thick with dread. His court no longer revolved around admiration. It revolved around survival. Every bow came with a calculation. Every smile hid fear. The king's moods had become volatile, unpredictable, as if some invisible beast gnawed constantly at his insides. In truth, the beast was real. It lived in his leg, his blood, his bones, and perhaps most cruelly, in his mind. Medical historians today believe Henry suffered from a cocktail of afflictions: chronic ulcers, gout, hypertension, possibly type 2 diabetes. There are whispers of syphilis, though that remains debated. What is certain is that pain governed his every hour. When he wasn't moaning through sleepless nights, he was screaming at servants, accusing old allies of betrayal, or sinking into long, wordless stupors, as if his soul had already begun to decay ahead of his body. And still he sought companionship, though what woman could look upon him without horror? At 49, he married Catherine Howard, a girl of just 19. He called her his rose without a thorn. But their union was less romance and more grotesque theatre. Henry, obese, suppurating, reeking, could barely walk. Catherine, fresh-faced and frightened, soon sought affection elsewhere, in the arms of a younger courtier. When Henry learned of her betrayal, the earth itself seemed to tremble with his rage. He ordered her beheaded. Some said he wept after her death. Others claimed he never blinked. His final marriage to Catherine Parr was less of a union and more of a surrender. She was no naive maiden. She was intelligent, composed, and understood her role. Nurse, caretaker, queen in name only. She tended to his sores. She managed his medicines. She read to him when his eyes could no longer focus on the page. And while others flattered and feared him, she saw the truth. This was not a king, but a crumbling relic desperately trying to remember what it meant to be human. Even the palace walls began to change. Drapes, soaked in lavender and myrrh, were hung to mask the odor. Perfumed sachets were stitched into tapestries. Courtiers carried handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. Still, nothing could cover the rot. It was said you could smell the king from 3 rooms away. Physicians tried sealing his ulcers with wax and pitch, hoping to trap the putrefaction. It never worked. The leg had gone black now, gangrene had set in, and as the disease devoured his flesh, it seemed to devour what little was left of his sanity. He trusted no one. Spies lurked in every corner of the court. Conversations were hushed, eyes constantly scanning for eavesdroppers. People disappeared, friends, advisors, even family members, on nothing more than a hunch or hallucination. The Tower of London filled once again, not with criminals, but with ghosts of loyalty. One of the last to fall was Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a poet, a soldier, a man of wit and valor, accused of imagining himself too close to the throne. The charge was absurd, but the verdict was sealed. He was executed just 9 days before Henry's own death. The king, barely breathing, still found the strength to sign his name in blood. Perhaps the greatest irony was Henry's obsession with poison. Convinced someone would try to end his life before God did, he created a meticulous food inspection system. Every dish tasted, every cup examined, silverware polished and blessed. But the real poison lay not in his plate, it was in his veins, spreading steadily from within, unstoppable. By the winter of 1546, Henry could no longer stand without help. His hands shook, his vision blurred. Fever came and went like a tide, stealing his breath, his memories, his grip on reality. On certain nights, his nurses reported strange murmurs, half prayers, half confessions. He would whisper the names of his wives, Jane, Anne, Jane, over and over. Sometimes he would ask for his mother. Other times he called out to God and received only silence in return. But no one could say he was dying. That, by law, was treason. Even as his body collapsed inward, as fluids seeped from his legs, as the smell of decomposition clung to his living skin, the official story remained unchanged. The king was recovering. The king was healing. The king, they said, would soon walk again. On the night of January 27, 1547, something shifted in the corridors of Whitehall. The palace, so often a theatre of whispers and formalities, was now submerged in a suffocating stillness. Physicians hovered just outside the royal bedchamber, exchanging glances but saying nothing. Servants paced, careful not to make eye contact. Ministers stood idle, trapped in a strange limbo, waiting for death without daring to name it. Inside the room, Henry VIII lay immobile, bloated and soaked in sweat. His breathing was shallow, laborious, like a furnace struggling for its final puff of flame. His legs, grotesquely swollen and dark with infection, remained exposed to the cold air. The stench had become unbearable. Cloth soaked in perfume was draped beneath his chin, over his chest, around the base of the bed. It did little to help. Even the thick oak door could not contain the aroma of decomposition. Still, no one called it death. To do so was to be accused of treason. English law dictated that predicting the monarch's demise, even when he was visibly rotting, was an act of rebellion against the crown. So they played the game. They bowed, they smiled, they insisted the king was merely resting. All while the corpse within him grew restless, eager to emerge. Finally, perhaps out of desperation, someone summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. The priest entered the room with solemn reverence, unsure if the king was even aware of his presence. He leaned close and whispered prayers. Then he asked the question, did the king die in the Christian faith? Henry could not speak. His eyes remained closed, but slowly, faintly, he squeezed Cranmer's hand. It was the only answer he would give. Hours later, without ceremony, without witness, Henry Tudor, King of England, exhaled for the last time. He was 55 years old, but if death offered dignity, it did not offer it to Henry. His body, now fully surrendered to rot, posed a horrifying logistical nightmare. He was too large for a standard coffin. Carpenters were summoned in the middle of the night to build a custom casket large enough to contain the once glorious monarch. The process of embalming, rudimentary at best, could barely manage a man of such size and condition. The viscera were removed with difficulty, the internal cavities packed with spices, herbs, and cloths soaked in alcohol. But nothing could stop what had already begun. The gases of decomposition swelled within his corpse. The fluids began to rise, and with them, so did the threat of public shame. His body was placed in a temporary chapel at Sion Abbey, resting beneath velvet drapery and surrounded by guards. Outside, the night air was cold and still. Inside, silence reigned, until it didn't. Some say it happened around midnight. A faint sound like the drip of water, then another. The soldiers posted nearby noticed a dark trail seeping from the base of the coffin. They followed it with their eyes, horrified, as it slithered across the stone floor of the chapel. It was putrefaction. The royal flesh, bloated with internal decay, had begun to leak. A crack in the casket had given way to the inevitable, and then, the worst of it, a pack of stray dogs, drawn by the scent, slipped in from the shadows and began lapping at the fluid. By morning, the tale had already begun to spread. Chroniclers recorded it with grim fascination. The mighty King of England, who had defied the Pope, dissolved monasteries, decapitated queens, and molded the church to his will, now desecrated by street animals. His sacred body, once praised as the embodiment of majesty, reduced to a feast for the lowest of creatures. The funeral, scheduled weeks later, became an exercise in endurance. The odor was overpowering, seeping through the wooden panels of the custom-built coffin, yet no one dared turn away. Foreign envoys, bishops, noblemen, each held scented cloths to their faces, their eyes watering, their hands trembling as they paid their respects. On February 16th, nearly 3 weeks after his death, Henry VIII was finally laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. He was placed beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a legitimate male heir. There were no last proclamations of triumph, no divine interventions, just silence and stench, the echo of decay in a chamber built for glory. But even buried beneath marble and heraldry, Henry's legacy did not rest quietly. His death marked the end of more than a man. It marked the crumbling edge of an era built on illusion, the illusion that power can transcend pain, that divine right can silence decay, that kings do not die like beggars. The man who had broken England from Rome in pursuit of a son, who had spilled blood across altar stones to forge his own path, would be succeeded by that very son. Edward VI, born of Jane Seymour, crowned at 9. But the boy king was as fragile as he was intelligent. He ruled for just 6 years before succumbing to illness at the age of 15. The very heir for whom Henry had burned bridges, severed ties, and reshaped religion vanished like smoke. Then came Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the queen Henry had cast aside. She tried to return England to Catholicism, to undo her father's revolution with fire and steel. Her reign was brief, tormented by ghosts and scorched by executions. And then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the girl Henry once deemed illegitimate, the child of the wife he sent to the scaffold. She would rise to become England's greatest monarch. There, in the cold arithmetic of history, lay the final irony. The women Henry had wronged, discarded, and destroyed gave rise to a legacy far greater than the son he had so desperately chased. In trying to control the future, he had ensured it would slip through his fingers, but beyond the throne and the bloodlines, what remained? A portrait on the palace wall. A man in rich furs, standing broad and unbending, his eyes fixed, his hands clenched, as if in control. It was a lie. The man in that portrait was long gone. Behind the paint, behind the crown, had been a soul consumed by fear, flesh consumed by disease, and a mind unraveling under the weight of its own consequence. Modern historians debate his medical records, dissect his political strategies, analyze his letters. They discuss his legislation, his marriages, his religious reforms. But the part they often miss, the part that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks, is the unbearable truth that no power, no brilliance, no ambition, no army can shield a man from his own humanity. Henry VIII was no exception. He died like all men die, broken, alone, and terrified. In the end, he was not the man who changed England, not the tyrant who dissolved monasteries, not the father of queens. He was just a body, bloated and still, leaking fluids into the stone floor of a forgotten chapel, while dogs licked the remnants of a fading myth. And maybe that is the true lesson, not just of Henry's death, but of every towering figure who believes himself untouchable. Time does not negotiate. The flesh always wins. Power fades. Pain remains. And what we leave behind is not the image we construct, but the truth we cannot hide. The mighty king who once defied the heavens, who made and unmade laws by whim, who watched his wives walk to the executioner, left behind not a legacy of glory, but the reminder that even kings rot. So if you ever find yourself standing in front of his portrait at Windsor, staring into those proud, defiant eyes, remember this: he could silence a nation, but he could not silence his own body. And when the end came, it was not with a roar, but with a stench.